Welcome, everybody. I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government with Larry Summers. And I'm very fortunate today that we have a terrific seminar. In particular, the title is Maximizing COP26 and the Politics of Climate Negotiation. And one of the people that is a research fellow, a senior fellow within the center, is Chris Skidmore, and Chris is going to moderate the discussion with Amber Rudd. He'll fill you in on the details about Amber. But just a little bit of background about Chris. Chris is a member of parliament. And for this purpose, some of the important aspects of his background, in 2019, he was appointed interim energy and climate change minister, attending cabinet. And in this role, Chris signed the UK commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions into law by 2050, and he helped to secure the UK's bid to host the UN COP26 conference taking place in Glasgow this coming November. He also served as Minister of State for Health and Minister for the Constitution in the cabinet from 2016 to 2018. Chris studied history to the postgraduate level at Christ Church, Oxford, but we won't hold that against him. We are fortunate to have him at Harvard at this point, so we'll take that for what it is. And while he's at the center, he's going to be working on these topics. He's going to pursue a project on kind of quote mission zero, charting a course or running aground, choices and consequences for delivering a net zero in an uncertain world by 2050. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris. And Chris, thank you so much for helping set this up. And Amber, Chris is going to introduce you, but I just wanted to say thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, John, and thanks to all those who are attending virtually, and also those who are in person. It's good to see students back on campus, and I hope I'll be able to join you eventually when this travel ban has been lifted.
Chris, one thing I wanted to mention, sorry to interrupt. One thing I wanted to mention is that if you have questions, there is a Q&A box. This is a webinar, so there's a Q&A box, and you can put questions into the Q&A box. Chris and Amber are going to talk for a little bit, but he will try to get to those questions shortly.
Yeah,
sorry, Chris.
Absolutely. I'm here to sort of be a moderator and a chair, and so do put down any questions, and I'll try to group them together. And also those in the audience physically, if you've got sort of questions as well, I'll be coming to you, and there's a microphone in the room. But I'm delighted to have this opportunity to work at Harvard Kennedy School on this issue of net zero. As John finally mentioned, I signed net zero into law back in, I think it was June 2019. And actually it was the circumstances of taking sort of that net zero legislation through Parliament that actually prompted me to think about, is this the right course? We've got 70%, I think, of the Earth's surface has now sort of signed up to net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or thereabouts. And it's obviously going to be one of those sort of key measures and targets that a lot of countries' progress is going to be judged on at this COP26 in Glasgow in 3 weeks' time. And I think climate change isn't going to be out of the news. But what I wanted to do here was sort of get away from the structures and the official stance of the climate negotiations to actually say, well, what really goes on behind the scenes? From my own experience, I never got to attend a COP, so I'm really interested to hear from our guests today, who I'll introduce in a moment. But I did get to attend several other international climate negotiations, and as part of that, I realised that you've got what goes on out in public versus what is in private are two very different worlds, and it's worthwhile reflecting, I think, when we think about climate change on the politics, because the politics really does matter. If we're actually going to get the outcomes that we want to achieve, we've got to be able to think about the politics first. And I think just one sort of anecdote before I introduce our guest, and I shared this with our senior fellows at a meeting about a couple of weeks ago, and I said, what was the price of net zero for the United Kingdom? Not what will be the price. We're expecting it to come in the billions of pounds by 2050. But what was the price at the time? And the answer is 88 megatons of carbon dioxide. Now, why is that the case? Because in the UK, we have something called the Climate Change Act. It was signed into law by the Labour government in 2008. And actually, what I was able to do was just amend the Climate Change Act, which had set sort of our reduction of emissions of 88%, 80% of 1990 levels to 100%. That was all I needed to do. But to do that, I needed the permission of the Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer to actually get this across the line. And the UK has a carbon budget process every 7 years. We're now on, I think, carbon budget 3 going into carbon budget 4. And we just finished carbon budget 2. And we'd ended up at a surplus. And the Committee on Climate Change, an independent committee that sets the sort of what the overall envelope should be for our carbon budgets, said, great, we've overshot our budget, but that shouldn't count because actually we got the measurements wrong. And it was nothing to do with government policy. If anything, it was due to the fact there'd been a recession in 2008, which had led to a sort of slowdown in the economy and a reduction in carbon dioxide. But the then Chancellor at the time said, well, hang on a second, you've overshot the budget. I want to take the excess in carbon budget 2 and put it into carbon budget 3, 88 megatons worth of carbon. At which point the independent chair, Lord John Gummer, he's still there, wasn't very happy. And I had to broker a decision, a compromise between these two forces to see whether, actually we would give the Chancellor what he wanted. And the only way we would get the UK to sign net zero into law was if we got the Chancellor's permission. He wouldn't do so unless he said that he was going to get 88 megatons of carbon. And that was what it was. That's what the deal was struck behind the scenes with Philip Hammond. And then the UK signed net zero into law. And we did so one day ahead of France. And that was also a big sort of driver within the government, within cabinet, because we had Theresa May was just about to resign. She'd set her leaving date. And we wanted to give her a legacy to say that actually she had done something as Prime Minister. And then one thing was potentially net zero. That's just a small story of my own experience of actually how the politics really does matter. But, my experience is tiny in comparison to the vast experience of our guest today. Former Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. Actually, the last Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change for that position was merged into the Business Department, Amber Rudd. And she's also been our Home Secretary in the past and Secretary of State for the Department for Work and Pensions. She's no longer a member of Parliament. She's been freed from public service, but she remains completely committed in working in climate change. And I had a fantastic opportunity to continue working with her as part of something called Public Policy Projects, which she's the deputy chair. But Amber was actually the Secretary of State who took forward the negotiations at the Paris COP21 back in 2015. And for those watching, you might know every 5 years, you're meant to have this ambition COP that sets the agenda for the next 5 years to come. So some COPs are bigger than others. They happen every year, but the last big COP was in Paris, COP21, and now we've got the next big COP in Glasgow in COP26. So what I thought would be really good for students is to understand what happened at Paris. And Amber's going to give us a sort of insider view about how those negotiations took place, because obviously that was the time when all the countries' nationally determined contributions were begun to be set. And you had the rule book that was then was drafted, not necessarily agreed, but sort of at least the terms of reference were set out. And so we're going to hear from Amber a bit about Paris, and then we're going to get into a bit of a discussion about what does the legacy of Paris mean for Glasgow and COP26, and what we can expect potentially from COP26 in 3 weeks' time. But I'm delighted and honoured that Amber has been able to join us. I'm incredibly grateful. So Amber Rudd, can I hand over to you maybe to give your reflections on the politics of climate change and what you've seen from your own perspective in the past. Amber.
Great, Chris. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And John, great pleasure to be here as well. Great honour for me, to be honest. When we think about the politics of climate change, I think you have to divide it into two parts. And the first part is the national politics, some of which Chris has explained, the negotiations that take place between one department and another, making sure that Treasury will support the cost of the commitment that a government wants to make. That's the first part. And the second part is the international negotiation, which I'm going to say a bit more about later. But both those are like a kind of incredibly complicated Sudoku or rubric cube, where you move one side and another side jumps up to hit you. And don't let anybody tell you that it's a simple job to get the politics right. It's not. And you add that to that in democracies, you have to make sure as a government that whatever you want to do, you take the public with you. Because if you can't take the public with you, the public, who are also known as the voters, then they will make themselves heard. There is a phrase we sometimes use in politics, which is politicians know what to do. They just don't know how to get re-elected after they've done it. So you don't want to be caught by that particular difficulty. When I was made Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change by David Cameron in 2015, he said to me, keep the bills down, keep the lights on, and get me a deal in Paris. And I nodded sagely and ran to my department to try and work out what on earth he meant. And what he meant was something that became known as the trilemma, how you make sure that you have completely secure supplies of electricity, how you green it as much as possible, close reliable but dirty, dirty coal, and you make sure that you get a world agreement to move ahead, which is what we were going into in Paris. And I had to quickly get up to speed with these negotiations. And there were tremendous expectations going into Paris. When we arrived there, it wasn't obvious that it would be a success. Now people look back on it and they say, well, Paris was a milestone, it was a great success. But I have to tell you, as we went into it, it felt much more unsteady. For a start, the shadow of Copenhagen, which had taken place in, I think, 2009, was sort of hanging over us, which had been a previous COP which had failed. It had been too ambitious. The less developed countries had felt they were being pushed too hard by the more developed countries. The leaders in Copenhagen arrived at the end and they had their jets waiting in the airport, and so that they thought they could just sign and run. Certain determination that it shouldn't be, but it was also, you know, it was
Amber, I'm going to ask you to hold for just a second because we lost your voice. I don't know what happened, whether it's your end or our end, but the last minute or so, we ended up you cut out. So if you could just back up a little bit and maybe try again. And usually when this happens at my home, it's because my wife is putting something in the microwave, but I suspect that's not the issue here.
okay. If you raise your finger,
now we can hear you.
Okay, if you raise your finger again, I'll stop again. So I'm just checking my network while I do that. So I was just saying that our concern was that there wasn't going to be enough ambition. There was enough ambition, and the negotiations that took place in Paris took place under different groupings. And this is also, Chris and John, I think your listeners will be interested in this. You don't get 195 countries negotiating with each other. Everyone forms into a little group. So you get the small island states, you get the EU working together, you get obviously the Americans, and then a lot of the other less developed countries fall into one of the other big countries. So China would make its points usually through an African country, usually a sub-Saharan African country that might have received some support from China. So there were all sorts of different currents going on. But I would say that the success in Paris was down largely to the French negotiation, because Laurent Fabius, who was the former French Prime Minister who was in charge of the COP, just as Alok Sharma is in charge of the COP in Glasgow now, really ran a very effective negotiation team. Of course, he hadn't been held back by COVID, so he was able to go out and see all the different countries and get them on side ahead. The actual event, where you have 30,000 people, is like a huge trade fair with a little castle in the middle. And in the castle, there are walls. And within each wall, you get into closer and closer to the inner sanctum, where the president of the COP, in that case, Laurent Fabius, is there to have very occasional meetings with you. It's very presidential, the actual event. And over different days, every 2 or 3 days, he would put a new text out. So every 2 or 3 days, a new text came out, putting different pressure on different parts of the globe. So asking, say, African countries to make a commitment of X, and asking the more developed countries to make a commitment of money of Y. And these swung back and forth every 2 or 3 days until finally we got to the end of the 2 weeks. And he basically switched off the food and water. So it's an extraordinary thing to say, but it's quite common, I gather, in international negotiations where you have a sort of forcing mechanism where it gets just so painful. You're negotiating all night and there was one coffee trolley outside. As I say, it sounds trivial, but it matters because people want to reach a conclusion. And in the end in Paris, we did reach a conclusion. It was ambitious enough. The last nervousness was over whether it would be deemed a success or not. Who deems it a success? Because that is a question which people will be asking about Glasgow in 4 weeks' time. And really, it is the external participants, not so much the countries, but the external participants, the NGOs, the big green climate think tanks, the big names like Greenpeace, and they will either give it the thumbs up or the thumbs down. And there will be a momentum in the last couple of days as to whether it's going to go well or whether the feeling is against it. So getting the PR right on the final few days is going to be really important as well. So in terms of the politics, you've described, Chris, some of the politics each country has to do. And I think that's incredibly important because elected people obviously want to take people with them. But the politics that we're looking at now as we go into Glasgow is about making sure 195 countries are able to commit and to turn around to their electorate, their stakeholders, their bosses, whoever it is, and say, I have delivered. Everybody who goes to that on behalf of their country has to be able to go back and say, I have delivered for the people who have sent them there. And everybody has different agendas. Money plays an awfully big part of this. So the less developed countries have to be able to go back and say they've got the money they need to develop on a low carbon pathway, which is what they will have committed to. So I think that what we're looking at in Glasgow is not so much can we sign one agreement, but can we get sufficient commitments to keep 1.5 degrees within reach? That is the aim. And I would say, as you said earlier, Chris, that with 70% of the world's mass sort of committed to a net zero pathway, it looks likely it can be done. But I would compare the politics now to the politics in Paris, and I find them much more unknown, really, much more precarious. In Paris, the US and China were, well, they weren't at each other's throats, shall we put it like that. They were willing to negotiate closely. There was more of a shared common endeavor. Now the politics have got much more difficult. The second thing I would say is that as we come out of COVID, the politics of who's been vaccinated and who hasn't will form part of the dissatisfaction amongst the less developed countries. We are basically asking them to industrialize with low carbon. And they may well, and they already are, turning around to some of us and saying, yeah, it's all very well you asking us to share in this international world endeavor. Where are our vaccines? And a lot of them haven't had those vaccines. They're not happy about it. And the third one is that we are in an unexpected energy crisis right now. I don't think in the US you're feeling it like we are, because you have your own sources of gas and export very little of it in order to keep the prices down. But in Europe, it's very tense at the moment with the prices going up, and the feeling of being saved potentially by Putin is not a pleasant one at all. So the fact that we're going into a major international climate conference where energy is the core participant, as it were, and we have an energy crisis on our hands is not going to be helpful at all. So the politics just got a whole lot more complicated. But on the other hand, I would also say, and this is my final point before handing back to you, Chris, for conversation perhaps, since Paris, two other important things have happened. One is the technology and the ambition and the ability to deliver has moved further and faster than we thought it could 6 years ago. I'm talking about the prices of offshore wind, the development of batteries, the way so much money is being invested into the area. That has been fantastic. So in a way that should give us all cause for hope and enthusiasm that we can reach the ambitions. And the second part, which also puts more motor, more energy underneath the ambition here, is that between now and the past few years, we have seen so much more evidence of climate change. 6 years ago, when I was in Paris and David Cameron said, "Get me a deal in Paris," it felt like a sort of niche idea of David's in a way, David Cameron, our Prime Minister. It wasn't quite so mainstream. Now everybody knows we have to address dangerous climate change. Everybody can see the consequences, the floods, the droughts, the weather changing, the immigration as a result. It's everywhere. So the need is in everybody's minds. And that, of course, should enable the politicians to be able to deliver. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, Amber, thank you so much for that wonderful overview and insight into Paris. I should actually just say John O'Dell's just posted in the Q&A function that Cambridge University Press are publishing a book next week on the Paris Agreement, the inside stories. So maybe we can get a copy sent to you and we can check whether your name is in the index to start with. Or whether you add anything ready for version number 2, maybe. But we're really keen to sort of take your reflection on Paris and how that translates across to COP. So you mentioned 30,000 people turning up in this wonderful example of the castle with various turrets around it. Will we know at the beginning, do you think, sort of the level of a country's ambition and willingness to negotiate depending on who they send? Does that give you the first smoke signal about sort of the levels of seniority? Because as you mentioned, China has not sort of committed. They haven't submitted their national determined contribution for 2030 yet. And obviously, if we don't have some of these bigger countries sort of letting out their plans, then maybe the COP might already the wheels might come off even before it begins. So is there anything we should look out at the start, so actually this is promising, or actually this may not go to plan? Any of those early warning signs you could suggest?
All of them, all countries have been asked and invited to send their leaders. So just as in Paris, it would be good for the UK as hosting it and good for a better outcome, I believe, if the prime ministers or leaders, whoever they are, actually do come. So that's a sign of commitment. I mean, the Australians at the moment are saying Scott Morrison might not come, and he is sending a signal that he doesn't want to be told off for not having made their net zero commitment, and they haven't, of course. So I think looking out for which leaders decide not to come is quite significant. I think that with China, it's very difficult to read. My contacts tell me that China is actually doing very well. And if they wanted to put in an NDC, they could, which would be perfectly positive, but that they don't want to do it and to jump to the Americans' tune, because Biden keeps on saying, we need a NDC. They're like, we're not on those sort of terms at the moment. So I think that's got caught up in the politics. I know some people think that the Chinese are doing even better than that. And once we get beyond COP, then you'll begin to see their plateau come forward from where it's been anticipated. Yes, it'd be good to see the leaders of countries coming. I think the delegations will be smaller. There's been, the UK is still requiring some countries who are on the red list to quarantine when they arrive, which is irritating for them because every country tends to think that their foreign ministers or energy ministers are, very important, and they don't want to be popped into a hotel for 10 days or whatever it is. So I think the delegations will be smaller, which is a good thing. And of course, there will be a certain amount of COVID restrictions at the event. And that will only work if there are a good deal less than 30,000. So I think it'll have a less of a sort of fluid jamboree type feeling than Paris had because of the COVID consequences, which will be inhibiting on the group meetings.
And you've talked about that sort of whole dynamic of perceived success sort of being something that is always in the background of the negotiations, ready to sort of, presenting the final text. And I wondered with that, what you felt, as someone who's significant within the climate ecosystem now, what would be a success? Because I don't know about you. I mean, they seem that sort of, it's probably the wrong word to use, smoke signals, but sort of clearly ending the use of coal is something where the UK has been making a big play on that for quite some months now. To the point that actually that happens, it was, for me, it was sort of, well, I sort of assume that might be the case. That doesn't come as a surprise if there's an international ending of the use of coal, apart from maybe Australia and Russia not playing ball. But I don't know if there's any other areas where you would say, aside from getting the NDCs to 2030 and net zero signed up, what would you see as sort of other successes that potentially could make this a successful COP?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't think you can bank the end of coal like that, particularly with gas going through the roof in terms of its price, because people will be reviving coal if gas stays up here. And countries that were thinking that they could industrialize using gas as a bridge will not be able to at this price. So they will fall back on coal. So one of the consequences of this gas crisis, as it were, is adverse. A lot of people think that this gas crisis will push us into renewables. There's a much more immediate problem that it'll make people turn to coal. And the other thing on coal is that 80% of the coal mines in America are in Republican areas. So the Republicans are not going to support the end of coal in their areas unless there's an alternative. So the end of coal, I think, will only work if you have something to replace it with. And that might be, hydrogen, it might be an electrolyzer, it might be small modular reactors, which you and I have talked about in the past. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on coal, but it is right to focus on it, to make it an ambition. But I wouldn't bank it yet. I know that the COP unit have described it as coal, cars, cash, and trees. And those are the big ones. And I would compare it in Paris. What we had to do was get one agreement everybody signed up to. It's as though they are trying to conduct an orchestra this time, trying to get a series of announcements on these 4 topics. But there's no question that the COP unit, who are obviously running it when it comes to Glasgow, are beginning to line up where those announcements are coming from. And they hope to make those announcements and then add them up and demonstrate that these have been significant enough to say we can keep 1.5 within reach as long as we make these next ambitions, and then to pass the baton on. But I think that this COP will have more of a trade fair feel to it than Paris did. And that's partly because there is so much going on. Probably like me, you get approaches from people with the latest venture they've got, which could transform our energy. People used to be very skeptical about even the possibility of nuclear fusion. And now there's a number of projects going on where it could take place. Obviously, nuclear fission we know about, which is lots and lots of different initiatives. We hear about Bill Gates's plan with terra firma, but there's lots more taking place. Different ways of making solar cheaper, geothermal, on and on it goes. So I think one of the fun things about Glasgow is it will showcase all the different ways of producing clean emissions. And that will be a fun element of it. But what I hope to see is a series of announcements building that momentum, and then the green groups that are watching to say, this is good, this is sufficient to keep it alive. Warning, there will always be some who say this isn't enough. And we know who they are already, but we have to just hope that the wall of support for the agreement outweighs or silences in some way the people who think that it's not enough.
Thank you. And I've got a couple of questions coming, so I'll turn to those in a moment. I wanted to go back to Paris and talk about the agreement and Article 6 and sort of some of the areas of Paris that still haven't been adopted. Does there come a point, sort of six years on, I think now, sort of that we have to revisit Paris and sort of say, well, actually, the parts of this agreement aren't going to work? Will there be any revisions to Paris in a way that sort of sees Paris watered down? Or are you hopeful that maybe on Article 6, which covers the sort of international sort of collaborations, that we might get it over the line one day, given the geopolitical situation has slightly tightened and some of those relationships aren't as cordial?
I don't detect that the COP unit who are running it are putting any weight on Article 6 at all. I mean, it used to be talked about a lot as the missing part, the rule book of the Paris Agreement, that we would get to it at some stage. But I'm interested that you raise it, Chris, because there's been very little said about it so far. And I think that is because of the international politics being so tricky. It was always said, you know, that Paris was a binding commitment from countries to decarbonize. They've submitted their own NDCs and they committed to doing it. The hard truth of it, though, is that it wasn't really legally binding insofar as nobody was going to be held to account for it as though you had crossed NATO. Nobody was going to invade another country because you hadn't lived up to what you'd committed to. It was about transparency and sort of shaming. So I still think that the bigger push from governments to deliver this is the public putting pressure. If the public put pressure on them because they can see what's going on if something doesn't take place, then also consumers will, voters will, businesses. We know that businesses are, you know, have a lot in common with politicians in a way. They, instead of having voters, they have consumers or they have investors, and they have to please those stakeholders. And all those different stakeholders are much more committed to getting a low carbon outcome than they were in Paris. And that's why I think we can hope for some success, because there's much less prevarication around the ambition. The consumers, the voters, the funders, the investors, everybody, I mean, not everybody, obviously, but many more people than sort of 6 years ago feel the necessity to do something here. And I think that's what will create the momentum to get ambitious announcements, and hopefully we'll be able to declare it a success.
Chris, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself there. But I was trying to sort of read some of the questions. It wouldn't let me do it. Maybe I've spoken too much already. So just reflecting on some of those questions and sort of putting them in my own language. Harvard seems very keen on looking at technological solutions. I found there's a number of departments, but both in the Moscow Romney Centre, but also the Belfast Centre for Science, that is interested in carbon capture, storage, solar radiation, you know, sort of the next stages of technological developments. You've mentioned nuclear. To what extent do these technologies actively form part of the climate negotiations rather than just being sort of exhibited on the side? Is there anyone going in championing for these technologies and saying, actually, this should be sort of accounted for and we need investment in this? Or is it just sort of a nice extra? I think sort of be really good to get a sense of, you know, to what extent technological solutions are considered, you know, a serious part of the solution, or whether it's seen as sort of, you know, somehow sort of just encouraging increased sort of carbon emission.
Well, it's interesting because most of the new technologies, once they get out of the universities, are taken on by the private sector. And it's the private sector that has just a huge role to play in trying to make sure that we all can have clean energy in the future. And as long as government is smart enough to create the policy framework for that, to get them started, then the evidence is that they can do just that. So I think that in terms of preferences, most people's view is that we need to just do everything we can. So I've heard government ministers say it's not big nuclear or SMRs, it's both. We've got to do it all because we don't know who will, which one will end up the victor. Different countries have, of course, different preferences based on their own natural geography. So if you've got a lot of gas, you kind of want to keep the gas going for a bit longer than perhaps other countries do. India are very keen on solar, and for good reason. But the other thing that I can see developing in an interesting way at this COP that it wasn't really in the last COP is about grids. How we can all smarten our grids, how we can have in some areas. I was talking to the Australians about what they want to do at COP, what they're going to showcase. And they want to showcase, no, sorry, the Canadians. What the Canadians want to showcase is some microgrid work. So, areas that don't have a grid, how do you have a microgrid that works for a whole community? The Indians at the moment are conducting a bidding auction basically from the government to deliver a green grid into certain areas, which means basically taking renewable energy and delivering it to communities. I think there's an awareness, and there certainly is in the UK, that I heard somebody referred to them as grandfather grids. We've got grandfather grids. They were designed for a different world where people weren't thinking of reducing carbon emissions. And what we've got in the UK is we're all trying to plug into these grids, and they are not localized. They need to be. They are not price sensitive enough as they need to be, so that when we charge our cars, we charge them at night rather than during the day when people are using the electricity for manufacturing, etc. There are so many smarter ways we need to make our grids. So I think there's areas that haven't been revealed enough, which different countries will be talking about. And I mean, as an example, the grids will be particularly the countries that don't have a big national grid yet. They will be the ones. But then you'll get other countries like Norway. Norway is very good on gas, but it's also very good on hydroelectric power, which gets 70% of its electricity from hydroelectric power. But of course, that won't suit other countries. So there is an element of it being a showcase opportunity for different countries. Each country within the COP itself, the conference center, will have what they call a chalet in the zone, in which they will have their negotiating team based. And depending on the character of each country, the chalet will be done up in a certain way. I can tell you that in Paris, ours just had lots of Union Jacks. We were way ahead of this government. The Indians, I remember, had a very elaborate chalet, much bigger than everybody else's, with a beautiful waterfall out the front. The Americans went for size. It was a very big chalet indeed. They had a very big delegation. So you will see everybody having their different national character coming through in their own little chalet in the zone. And they will each be exhibiting and wanting to promote the source of energy that is best for them.
And in terms of other countries, you've mentioned some countries, developing countries. When it comes to COP26, some of the questions in the chat box have come up to ask about the $100 billion package, which hasn't been met, even though that was sort of 5 or so years ago. And how important will fulfilling that be? I mean, we've done a couple of webinars where we've seen other countries talk about reparation money for Western countries emitting carbon in the past. And do you think this will be a sort of political phenomenon that's going to grow and be a feature of the conference? And if we don't manage to sort of get $100 billion over the line, will that sort of cause sort of issues and problems for those smaller countries agreeing to their contributions?
It's hugely important. I mean, imagine what we're asking. We're asking countries that have never industrialized or only partly industrialized to do so in a way which is free of the most effective way of industrializing, coal and gas, which is what we used in order to become developed countries. It's a big ask. It's quite a cheeky ask, really, given that we have created a lot of the pollution that is causing the problem. And the only way to possibly legitimize that ask is to pay for it so that the electricity that they will be generating is clean. We can't just, it'd be unreasonable to ask them to do it without paying for it. So the money is absolutely critical. And I think that the one way that COP could crater is over the money, because it's also in a slightly awkward position where there's a demandeur on one side and somebody with a checkbook on the other side, and the it's a bit grubby. And it does get a bit like that. The French were very good. They were very distinguished about it, very careful about it. And I just think that that's the one area where things could get ugly. I hope not, they don't, but they can get uncomfortable. We're currently, according to the OECD, at 79 billion a year. Biden's just announced more money. I think that puts it up to 83 or 84 billion. But the pledge was 100 billion per year, going up to 200 to 500 billion a year in the next, I think, 3 to 4 years. So they've really got to be able to see that there's money coming, so that their commitments can be based on the support that they want to get from us. And then, of course, that brings us not away from the international politics to the national politics again. You and I know all about that, Chris, in the UK, where it's quite difficult to get your voters' support for spending money on climate change overseas. And other countries will have the same problems as well. So that is an area where the rubber could hit the road.
Fascinating. I'm going to turn to anyone in the room in Cambridge, whether you'd like to ask a question. I think there's a microphone that is available. It'd be great to get a bit of interaction going as well, rather than me just reading off the questions. Is there anyone who'd like to? I think Benson got his hand up, I can see. So if you want to ask your question, hopefully we'll be able to hear it.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. This has been fascinating so far. Continuing on that same trend, and I think I know what the answer to this is, but I'm just sort of curious to hear your thoughts on it. Whether or not there'll be sort of any revisiting of like the zero liability loss and damage framework, you know, where over and above financing, whether or not, you know, locked in losses will be sort of paid for by Western nations at all. And again, I think I know what the answer is, but I'm just curious.
I mean, I think that your instinct is that there won't, and I think that you'd be right. It's difficult enough to get countries to commit to big sums of money to help other countries industrialize. They won't want to do it on the basis of loss and damage. We just owe you because we made such a mess of this by polluting the atmosphere. So I don't think that'll be the way it'll go, but I think I don't expect that to be a huge pushback from the less developed countries. I mean, as Chris was saying, we've done a number of think tank events with ambassadors and high commissioners from the sort of countries that in the past would push for that. And they tend to push for now just getting the money to industrialize rather than pushing hard on loss and damage. I think that's moved on. I may be proved wrong.
Thank you very much. I think there's a gentleman at the back I can see. So would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. The question is around both from a domestic and an international standpoint. You know, we have a lot of science on what needs to be done to be able to meet the targets, whether it's 1.5 or various other targets. You mentioned the intricacies of politics and negotiation. How do you sort of square the difference between, you know, negotiating over different amounts of emissions? Certainly implementation is a different thing, but negotiating over certain amounts of emissions when there's sort of a binary, either we're making it or we don't, that the science says.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult because, you know, we need to keep it down to 1.5. And I gather most of the scientists say we are at best on the trajectory of 2.4, which is pretty catastrophic. But the only thing I would say is that 2.4, which I'm sure we will exceed, I mean, do better than over the next few years. I hope we'll get commitments to bring that right down. It could have been a lot worse. I don't really think it's as binary as either we succeed or we don't. There's a big grey area here of, are we already making it less catastrophic than it could be? Yes, we are. Can we do better and go faster? Yes, we should. And in the end, will we get there to 1.5 or below? I do think we will, but not without tremendous effort and, you know, no complacency. So I sympathize with you, because in a way you could look at it and say, here's the bucket. You can only fill it so high. How are you going to divide what's left in the bucket? Who's going to get to that? And less developed countries make a very reasonable case for it. And they will say, you must allow us to do this and allow us to use at least gas to do that. Not even if we bypass coal, we must be able to have gas to do it. And then they use up the whole budget. So it is a very difficult one. It's part of the politics. And if you were sitting in a negotiating room and having this, that would be an argument to say, therefore, we need to put more money on the table so that people in less developed countries can industrialize and not use gas, but go straight to the latest technology and a smart grid, which will deliver it just as effectively. But we need another 10 billion to do that now. So I think that's an argument that will come up again and again, and hopefully be used to raise more money to keep the carbon emissions down, but to allow people to industrialize at the same time. And just to keep in your minds all the time is that energy is life. You know, people who don't have energy have no quality of life. You know, they in India, you have these cook stoves where people are dying of suffocation because they're inside people's homes and they use wood, and you can't industrialize, you can't have a job, you can hardly work from school if you can't have some sort of electricity. So it's not reasonable to hold people back on there. We have to help people find a way of delivering electricity, and they have to do it in a way which we want them to, which means we have to pay for it. A lot of this comes back to money all the time.
I think sort of returning to that sort of theme of money, one of the questions in the chat box raised this quite a specific issue, actually maybe is a more general issue that seems to be on the horizon, which is that of trade. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, that the EU is currently sort of consulting on and sort of developing sort of finer details, obviously potentially puts a price or sort of additional tax effectively on certain imports that are high carbon. Could that be create sort of nervousness, or will that be raised, do you think, within the negotiations, or is that something for the future that at the moment won't be covered in COP?
I understand that there are certain subjects that the COP team have asked to keep off the agenda at the moment. And one of them is the CBAM. So the EU, I don't think, will be out there discussing it. Inevitably, there will be some discussions around carbon taxes, because carbon taxes, a worldwide price on carbon would be the simplest way to solve everything. If it was fair, if it was transparent, if it was effective. But that is not what's on offer. Personally, overall, I think the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is a good one, particularly if you haven't got China committed to the same reductions. But I know there were all sorts of unintended consequences the other side. So it would have to be really carefully thought out to make sure that it doesn't have adverse consequences for countries in terms of trading, particularly from the less developed countries.
And a couple of questions have raised this theme up. Looking back at Paris, we had commitments from certain countries, and some of those countries have, not met their commitments and targets at all. So, how can there be greater accountability to countries being held, to these targets for the future? Because otherwise, we'll go another 5 years, and sort of the wheel will turn. Have you got any thoughts of whether COP26 actually is going to create sort of a meaningful dynamic in which there will be accountability, or will it again be just sort of statements sort of we have to then will move in the right direction?
I think there's much more transparency now. There's much more interest now from the public. So I think there are less places for people to hide. I mean, one of the things that I keep saying is that time for pledging is over, the time for delivery is now. And I think that the evidence of that is going to be much more carefully pored over than it was between Paris and now. And one of the reasons for that is the scale of climate change around us, so people care much more. But the other is you can see much more of what is actually taking place. We can see from the private sector satellites above us what is going on in the rainforests in Brazil. We can see what is taking place with farming, what has been committed and what isn't. So I think there is the combination of more accountability, because the public want their governments to do something about it, combined with the technology of visibility, is going to make it much more difficult for countries to avoid transparency on the commitments that they're making.
And on the sort of point around sort of individual countries' commitments, there's come a question about specifically the US involvement in all this. And obviously, you know, since Paris, we've seen a number of administrations pass, but obviously one of those administrations was Donald Trump's. And the question is, you know, did the Trump administration's sort of, you know, commitment really to coal and to carbon, has that sort of allowed the whole world to sort of go off track? And if the US sort of fails to pass this sort of landmark bill around you know, creating sort of a greener USA, will that have ramifications potentially for sort of, you know, the global climate change negotiations in the future?
I think we are very lucky that this COP is taking place under Biden. And if we hadn't had COVID, it would have taken place under Trump. And that would have made it almost, I genuinely think, probably impossible to succeed. So postponement has been a bonus for people who want to see action here. And Biden's commitments are enormous. And, you know, the spending that he's pledging, Chris, as you say, is huge and is significant and will be a great boon to trying to get it done, trying to get momentum around the spending that we need to actually deliver on the overall global agreement. But the other thing I would say is that while Trump put the US to sleep over climate change, plenty of the individual states in the US did a lot, upgraded their grids, the individual states put in place the sort of contracts for difference that we have here in the UK to support renewables. So it didn't mean that the country as a whole went to sleep on delivering on renewables. It was just at a state level. Finally, though, on that subject, is that when I talk to businesses, there is some nervousness that Trump may be back. You know, as you pointed out earlier in your introductory remarks, in the UK, we have a Climate Change Act, which was supported by both main political parties and is monitored by an independent committee who looks at carbon budgets. There is nowhere to hide in the UK, and it has complete political consensus. Not so in our friends in the US, as we know only too well. And the spectre of Trump coming back in 2024 is a little nervous-making for the businesses who are going to invest in this sector overall. The good news is that by the time we get to there, it's happening even now, renewables are becoming less expensive than carbon sources. So hopefully that will become unstoppable. Amber,
I'm going to ask one final question before we sort of wrap up this seminar. I was keen to sort of finish at 6, and thanks everyone for their attendance there. And sorry I couldn't answer all of the questions in the time, but we titled this seminar Maximising COP26. So this is a hypothetical question. If you were yourself, and I know you're going to be at COP in Glasgow and look forward to seeing you there, but if you were there as the chief negotiator or part of the UK delegation team, or even if you were in the place of Alex Sharma as COP president, what would you be doing now to in the final leg to prepare? And what would you sort of see as sort of being a success for you about trying to maximise this last couple of weeks, and then obviously for the event itself? Just your final thoughts.
Well, you'll have heard from my earlier remarks that I think that the money is going to be the critical issue. So I would be doing some extra work on the money, finding some extra sources. You know, it's not just countries, governments making commitments, it's big organizations like the World Bank. And I don't know whether he's managed to get much private sector commitment as part of it, but I would be looking there as well, because it's about mobilizing 100 billion. It's not all gifting it. And I would say that if he can surprise on the upside, that will be the final piece that will be necessary to get an agreement with everybody. So I would try and arrive with a visible wallet and a secret wallet also full inside my back pocket.
Excellent. Well, that's quite an analogy to end on. And Amber Rudd, we're extremely grateful for your time today and being able to give those sort of candid insights into the world of climate negotiation, the politics involved. We're incredibly grateful, and thank you also to Moscow Ramani Centre for hosting this event today. I think it'll go up on YouTube. Hopefully it'll be a series where I'll be able to bring individuals who've played a prominent role in climate negotiation in the past. But obviously, we all look forward to COP26 in a couple of weeks' time, and let's see what happens. But I think if Amber was in post, we'd have a clear direction to see, certainly from the UK's perspective, of where we should go. And you've given us that clear direction and understanding today, and we're very grateful. So Amber Rudd, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Great pleasure.
Yep, Chris and Amber, thank you. And obviously we'll need to do a post Glasgow COP26 seminar as well, and we'll have you back to see how some of the predictions played out. But thank you so much for taking the time. And thanks for all the attendees coming.
Thank you.